He got the key to the castle left by the general. He thought the war had taken everything from him, even his dog. But as soon as he opened the door, he heard a familiar bark in the silence. Check out what he found inside. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The winter wind howled across the valley like something half alive, rattling the loose tin siding on the trailer that had long ago stopped being a home. Inside, under the faint amber light of a single desk lamp, Michael Rowan sat with his elbows on the scarred wooden table, a chipped mug of coffee cooling beside him. The radio on the counter hissed softly, tuned as always to the same military frequency he'd listened to for years, out of habit more than hope. He claimed it calmed him, the white noise, the occasional crackle, the hollow echo that sounded like distant rain. But sometimes he thought it was just the ghosts talking back. 20 years had passed since his discharge from the army, and most days blurred together. He lived on the edge of a small Montana town, whose name never appeared on any map, a place where forgotten men and rusted pickup trucks slowly became part of the same landscape. He worked nights as a watchman at an old equipment yard, where the cold crept through every joint and memory. When morning came, he'd drive back to the trailer, feed the stray cats that lingered under the porch, pour himself cheap coffee, and stare for a long time at the wall beside the door. There, hanging on a nail, was a cracked leather dog, collar faded brown, the brass tag still engraved with a single name: Ray. Ray had been the only creature to outlast his silence, the one living thing that had not recoiled from his broken edges. The dog had followed him through the slow decay of civilian life, through hangovers, through winter storms, through nights when Michael sat with his service pistol on the table and stared at it until dawn. Now the collar was all that remained. The trailer smelled faintly of oil and rain, the way old barracks sometimes do after everyone leaves. He rubbed the scar along his wrist, the one he'd earned, not in combat, but from an engine belt while fixing the generator 2 years ago. It had healed unevenly, a pale ridge that caught the light whenever he reached for his cup. Some mornings, he forgot what the wound was from, and thought instead of the desert, of the way sand sliced open skin when the wind rose, of the way voices crackled in the comms before going dead. He lived small. He spoke little. He believed in nothing except the weight of the days and the dull ache of memories that refused to fade. The letter came on a Tuesday morning, tucked between a grocery flyer and a bill he didn't intend to pay. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, stamped with an embossed emblem, the eagle and stars of the United States Army. His name, Mr. Michael Rowan, was written in deliberate, almost old-fashioned handwriting. For a long time he simply stared at it, as if the thing might burn through the table. Then, with the caution of a man defusing a mine, he slit it open with his pocket knife. Inside was a single folded sheet, a key taped to the corner. The letterhead read, Henderson Moore, Attorneys at Law Chicago, Illinois. He read the first line twice before it sank in. Dear Mr. Rowan, we regret to inform you that General Howard Cannon passed away on September 18th of this year. In accordance with his final will and testament, you have been named sole beneficiary of his private estate, located in the western Montana ranges. The property, known as Cannon Estate, is to be transferred immediately into your name. He stopped there. The words seemed absurd. General Cannon, his commander, had been gone from the service for decades. The last time Michael had seen him was on a hot, dust-choked airfield overseas. Cannon had been standing by the transport plane, cane in one hand, a leash in the other. The small shepherd pup had squirmed and barked, and the general had smiled, a rare, tired smile. He was my light in the dark, Cannon had said, kneeling to let the puppy sniff Michael's boots. Maybe he'll be yours. He'd pressed the leash into Michael's palm before the engines roared to life. Take him. Name's Ray. You'll understand why later. Now, 2 decades later, that name stared back at him from the key's engraving for the one who remembered the dog. Michael turned the key over in his hand. It was heavy brass, worn smooth around the teeth, the kind of key that belonged to something old. His chest tightened, not from grief exactly, but from the sudden intrusion of the past into the hollow rhythm of his present. He set the letter down, then picked it up again, reread the signature. James Henderson, executor of estate. It was no joke, no misunderstanding. The general had left him, of all people, an estate. He spent the rest of the day pacing the small space of the trailer, the key glinting in the dull light. Evening came, snow began to fall, and the radio hummed with distant static. Around midnight, he poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat down, and whispered into the empty air, "You old bastard. What the hell are you doing?" When dawn came, he packed a duffel bag. Spare clothes, a flashlight, the pistol, and a photo of Ray tucked into the side pocket. He looked around the trailer once before locking the door. Nothing in it was worth returning for. The road to the mountains stretched north, a thin gray line swallowed by fog. By noon, the small towns had thinned out. The world grew quieter, lonelier. The gas stations were little more than shacks. The people who ran them spoke in half phrases, eyes full of the wariness reserved for strangers who didn't smile. He drove with the heater on full, though his hand still felt cold on the steering wheel. The sky was iron gray, the clouds pressed low over the ridges. At a diner near the foothills, he stopped for coffee. The waitress, a woman in her 60s, with a silver cross at her throat, asked where he was headed. "Up north," he said. "What's up there?" He hesitated. "Cannon Estate." The clatter of a dropped cup behind the counter broke the silence. A trucker at the corner table looked up, his expression unreadable. The waitress gave a small shake of her head. "You're going up there?" she asked softly. "That place is cursed, mister. Folks say it talks back." Michael smiled without warmth. "So do I." He left cash on the counter and stepped out into the wind. The road narrowed as it climbed, twisting through forests of pine and snow-laden cedar. His truck groaned against the incline. At sunset, when the light began to fade, he caught the first glimpse of the house. It wasn't a house. It was a fortress of stone rising out of the mist, its towers shrouded in cloud. The drive curved upward, lined with half-collapsed walls and rusted lanterns. For a moment he thought of the castles in the old photographs that decorated Cannon's office, the places soldiers went to die in fairy tales. The air thinned as he climbed, each breath sharper than the last. At the gates stood a man in a heavy coat, his hair white, his posture rigid despite the cold. He held a lantern that flickered in the wind. "Mr. Rowan," the man said, his voice gravelly but steady. "Been expecting you. Name's Ellis. The general told me you'd come." Michael cut the engine and stepped out. "He told you?" Ellis nodded once. "Said you'd find your way sooner or later. Always believed you would." He lifted the lantern, motioning toward the massive doors beyond the courtyard. "House is ready. It's been waiting." The iron gates creaked open, and for the first time in years, Michael felt something that might have been awe or fear. The snow fell harder, muffling every sound except the crunch of his boots. The lantern light swung in slow arcs, painting the stones gold for a moment, before darkness swallowed them again. When they reached the entrance, Ellis pushed open the door. The hinges groaned like an old throat clearing itself. Inside, the air was cold, but dry, carrying the faint scent of cedar and dust. A grand staircase spiraled upward into shadow. To the left stretched a long hallway, lined with portraits' faces that seemed to watch, eyes painted with that same haunted pride common to soldiers. Michael stepped inside, his boots echoing on the marble. "He really lived here?" he asked quietly. "Every day of the last 10 years, Ellis said. Alone, mostly. Said he liked the silence. Said it reminded him of the men who didn't make it back." The door shut behind them with a final resonant thud. The sound seemed to settle into the bones of the house. Ellis handed him the lantern. "You'll want this. Power's on the fritz. Generators in the cellar if you need it. Guest room's upstairs, 3rd door on the right." Michael took the light, its glow trembling on the walls. He followed the old man's directions, each step stirring up dust and echoes. At the top of the stairs, he paused. The silence was absolute, so deep he could hear his heartbeat. In the guest room, a bed stood neatly made, the sheets crisp and white. On the nightstand lay another envelope, smaller, unsealed. He hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single note, written in the same careful hand he remembered from decades ago. "You've carried the weight long enough. Let this place carry the rest." No signature, but he didn't need one. He sat on the edge of the bed, the lantern light flickering across his face, and for the first time in 20 years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls, and the house seemed to sigh. Long, slow, like an old soldier finally breathing again. Michael lay back, eyes on the ceiling where faint cracks spread like rivers. He thought of the general, of the airfield, of the dog bounding toward him through the dust. He thought of the collar hanging back in the trailer, of the letter folded neatly in his jacket pocket, of the key heavy on the bedside table. When sleep came, it came gently, like snow settling over a battlefield after the guns have gone quiet. The last sound he heard before drifting off was the faintest echo something, between a sigh and a bark, rising from somewhere deep within the house, reminding him that some bonds never die, they only wait. And far above the valley, wrapped in cloud and silence, the old estate stood watch, its windows glimmering with the dull reflection of the lantern's light, as though the house itself remembered. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the mountains veiled in silver mist. From his window, Michael watched the fog drift along the ridges like a living thing, sliding down into the valleys and curling around the pine trunks. The world outside the house seemed so still that it frightened him a little. He had spent too long surrounded by noise engines, shouting, gunfire, the metallic rhythm of orders. Silence, real silence, pressed differently on the mind. It didn't comfort, it revealed. He dressed slowly, his breath fogging in the cold air of the room. The sheets smelled faintly of cedar. On the floor beside the bed, the brass key gleamed in the faint light. He slipped it into his pocket, as if to remind himself the letter and the journey hadn't been part of some elaborate dream. When he stepped into the corridor, the floorboards murmured under his boots. The hallway was lined with portraits, some half-faded, some cracked by time. Soldiers, horses, women in Victorian dresses, generations of cannon ancestors, staring down at him as though curious about this new intruder. Their painted eyes caught the lantern light in unsettling ways. Wherever he moved, the glint followed. Downstairs, he found Ellis in the kitchen, coaxing a reluctant flame beneath the iron stove. The old man nodded without turning. "Coffee's on the counter. Cold, but it'll do." Michael poured himself a cup and sat opposite him. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It felt like something inherited, part of the air that came with the house. "How long did you work for him?" Michael finally asked. "Long enough to watch him change," Ellis replied. His voice was low and dry, like gravel rolling in a tin. "The general came here right after the army put him out. Bought this place from his cousin. Said he needed high air and low company. Never left it since." Michael glanced toward the window. Beyond the frosted glass, snow flurries drifted like ash. He was sick? "Lonely's a kind of sickness," Ellis said simply. They finished the coffee in silence. When Ellis rose to tend the fire, Michael wandered through the adjoining rooms. Each doorway opened into another expanse of dust and shadow. The house was enormous, far too big for one man, or even 10. He passed through what must have once been a study. Shelves buckling under the weight of military memoirs and philosophy. Maps curling at the edges. A mounted flag hanging limp on the far wall. On the desk lay an old photograph in a tarnished frame. Cannon in uniform, years younger, kneeling beside a German shepherd. The dog's ears stood sharp, its eyes bright and intelligent. The handwriting on the back said, Rex, 1978. First of them. Michael placed the photo down carefully. The same faint unease he'd felt last night returned, the sense that the house wasn't empty. Not really. There was a rhythm here, soft but distinct, like the pulse of a sleeping animal. He couldn't have explained it, but it was there in the walls, the way the air held its breath whenever he entered a room. He spent the rest of the morning exploring. The east wing was filled with dust sheets draped over furniture. In one room, he found boxes marked Training Logs Project Silent Paw. The label drew him closer. He brushed the dust away and opened one of the boxes. Inside were file folders, film reels, photographs, images of soldiers and their dogs, training fields, barracks. Each photo carried a date and a number. He recognized one of the men almost instantly himself, 20 years younger, face leaner, eyes harder, holding a leash attached to a young shepherd with the unmistakable dark mask of Ray. The sight hit him like a blow. He sat down on the floorboards, the photo trembling in his fingers. He had forgotten what he looked like back then, or maybe he had tried to forget. There was a light in his face that the years had long since erased. And beside him, Ray looked exactly as he remembered, alert, focused, alive. There were papers, too, typed reports, evaluations of the dogs, behavioral notes. Subject, Ray High Intelligence, extreme loyalty to handler Rowan. Unfit for reassignment after incident in Sector Delta. The rest of the line was blacked out with ink. Michael turned page after page, piecing together a story that felt both foreign and intimate. Project Silent Paw hadn't just been about training dogs for war, it had been about healing. There were memos written by Cannon himself, philosophical reflections buried between military jargon. One read, "A man who learns to care for another living thing cannot remain entirely lost. Compassion is the only command worth following." The general's signature sprawled beneath the sentence. The light through the window had shifted by the time Michael realized how much time had passed. Afternoon sun cast long spears across the floor, stirring motes of dust that glittered like snowflakes. He returned the files to the box and stood. For a moment, he just listened. To the boards creaking, to the wind moving through cracks, to the steady tick of a clock somewhere far off. It was a house alive with memory. That night, as he sat by the fire in the grand room, Ellis joined him again. The old man had a flask in his coat and offered it wordlessly. The whiskey burned, spreading a warmth that made the silence feel almost companionable. "I found some of the general's papers," Michael said. Ellis nodded slowly. He kept everything. Said one day somebody might understand what he was trying to do. What was he trying to do? Make peace with the things he saw. Same as every soldier, I guess. Only he thought dogs might help more than doctors. Michael stared into the fire. He gave me one. Ray. Saved my life more than once. "I know," Ellis said quietly. "He used to ask about you. Kept your name on a list in his desk. Said you'd done what the program was meant for. Learned how to live with yourself." Michael didn't answer. He thought of the empty trailer, the collar on the wall, the years that had vanished like smoke. He hadn't learned to live with himself. He had simply learned not to die. When the fire died down, he climbed the stairs with the lantern. The air grew colder as he reached the upper hall. Somewhere deep within the house, wood popped as it contracted in the chill. But as he passed the long corridor lined with portraits, he heard another sound, a faint padding, like paws on wood. He froze, holding his breath. The sound came again, closer now, deliberate, measured. "Ellis?" he called softly. No answer. He turned toward the source, the lantern trembling slightly in his hand. At the far end of the hallway, shadows shifted near the doorway of a study. He could have sworn he saw movement, a blur of shape low to the ground. But when he reached it, there was nothing. Only the lingering smell of old leather and something faintly familiar. Dog fur, clean and sharp, the scent that used to cling to Ray's collar after rain. He stood there for a long time, heart beating too fast for a man his age. Then, with an exhale that fogged the glass of the lantern, he whispered, "You're losing it, old man." The next morning, he woke before dawn. The house was still dark, but faint static echoed somewhere close by. Following the sound, he descended into the basement where the generator hummed. On a work table sat a military radio massive, dust-covered, its wires coiled like veins. The static came from there. He turned the dial absent-mindedly, and for a brief second, through the hiss, he heard a single sharp bark. He stepped back. It was impossible. The signal faded immediately, replaced by silence. By afternoon, snow began again. He took refuge in the study, poring over more documents from the Silent Paw archive. The reports grew darker as they went on. Mentions of trauma. Men breaking down. Dogs put down when handlers couldn't be saved. Cannon's notes grew increasingly personal. Words written in the margins that no officer would include in an official file. Guilt spreads like frostbite. You don't feel it until you've already lost the limb. Michael understood too well. He found another box, smaller, marked with his initials, MR. Inside was a sealed envelope and an old cassette tape labeled, "For MR." The envelope contained only a single note in Cannon's hand. "Play it when you're ready to forgive yourself." He hesitated for hours before sliding the tape into an ancient player he found among the debris. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. Older, rasping, but strong. "Michael," it began, "if you're hearing this, it means I didn't manage to tell you what I should have long ago. You and that dog Ray. You were the proof that what we tried wasn't foolish. You kept each other alive when the rest of us were already half dead. I wanted to build something here that might outlast our ghosts. This house, these records, they're not relics. They're confessions. Everything we did was meant to save men from themselves. And in the end, I failed most of them. But maybe not you. The house is yours now. Treat it kindly. It remembers more than I do." The tape clicked off. For a long time, Michael sat staring at the machine, the weight of the voice pressing on his chest. He could almost see the general broad-shouldered, tired-eyed, the man who had once placed a squirming puppy into his arms and changed everything. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he walked the house. The hallways no longer felt empty. They felt occupied by unseen sentinels. Each creak of the floorboards seemed like an acknowledgement, each gust of wind through the chimney a whisper. Near midnight, he descended again into the basement, lantern swinging at his side. He'd noticed earlier that part of the floor near the wall looked newer, the boards lighter. Kneeling down, he pried one loose. Beneath it, something glimmered. He pulled away more boards until a small compartment revealed itself. A wooden box, perfectly preserved. Inside were dog tags, faded letters, and lying atop them all, Ray's collar. His breath caught. The leather was darker than he remembered, but it was unmistakable. The same stitching, the same worn buckle. Clean. Untouched by time. He sat back against the wall, clutching the collar. It smelled faintly of pine and something else. Something alive. A shiver ran through him, not of fear, but of recognition. The memories he had tried so long to bury surged up like floodwater. Ray pulling him out of the rubble after the blast. Ray lying beside him through fever. Ray watching him with patient eyes when no one else could bear to look. "Damn you, old boy," he murmured. "You never really left, did you?" The lantern flickered. Somewhere above, the house groaned in the wind. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard footsteps. Soft, 4-beat steps moving across the floor above him. He listened, tears stinging his eyes for the first time in decades. When he finally climbed back upstairs, the dawn light was already beginning to seep through the windows. He placed the collar on the mantel above the cold fireplace, then stood there, staring at it until the light touched the brass tag and made it shine like gold. Ellis found him there hours later. The old man said nothing. He didn't need to. The house itself seemed to hum quietly, as if satisfied that something long missing had finally been returned. Michael looked around the vast room, the portraits, the staircase, the silent air, and realized that the house wasn't haunted by ghosts at all. It was haunted by love that had nowhere else to go. He sat down in the armchair, the fire now kindled, and watched the snow fall beyond the window. The world outside was white and endless, but inside, the warmth began to creep back, slow and steady. For the first time in years, he let it. As dusk settled once more over the mountains, the last thing he heard before sleep claimed him was the faint sound of a dog's bark, echoing in the wind. Sharp, distant, and impossibly familiar. Morning came quietly, as though the mountain itself were holding its breath. The air in the house was still, heavy with that faint sweetness that follows a long night of snow. Michael stood before the window, the world outside blindingly white, the pine branches bent beneath new weight. He hadn't slept, though not for lack of trying. His mind replayed the voice from the tape, the words that had filled the silence between him and the general. One last time. The sound had carried something human, something regretful, and for the first time in years, it hadn't made him angry. It had made him feel seen. He turned toward the fireplace where Ray's collar rested on the mantel. The metal tag caught a slant of early light and gleamed softly. He reached out, his fingers brushing the brass, and felt again that small pulse of warmth, as if the metal itself remembered touch. The fire below had died to ash, but the room no longer felt cold. Ellis appeared in the doorway, hat in hand, a cautious look in his eyes. "You were awake all night," he said. "Couldn't sleep," Michael answered. "Too much noise in my head." "Noise," Ellis repeated with a faint smile. "That's what we call the thinking that hurts." He crossed to the hearth, crouched, and began stirring the coals back to life. When the flames rose, they painted his face gold and shadow. "The general left more for you than this house, you know," he said after a while. Michael frowned. "What do you mean?" Ellis didn't answer directly. He pointed toward the far wall, to a large oil painting of cannon in uniform. "Behind that," he said. "Safes built into the brick. Combination's probably the same as everything else he locked up his damn dog's birthday." Michael stared at the portrait for a long time before setting his coffee aside. Together, they took it down, revealing a narrow steel door set flush with the wall. The numbers turned stiffly under his fingers. 1123. There was a sharp click. Inside lay a bundle of papers, a small velvet box, and a folded letter sealed with dark wax. The letter was addressed simply, "To M. Rowan." Michael broke the seal with the edge of his thumb. The paper crackled as he unfolded it. The handwriting, even older now, slanted but firm, carried the same deliberate grace it always had. If you're reading this, it means the house found you before the world did. I never asked forgiveness from anyone, but if it's possible to leave a kind of apology behind, this is mine. I once signed a piece of paper that took the life of your brother. I believed it was the right call then, but I've lived every day since knowing that belief doesn't erase consequence. I saw the look in your eyes the day you learned the truth, though you never said it aloud. You followed orders, as did I, but orders aren't absolution. Michael's breath caught. His hand trembled slightly as he continued. When I gave you that dog, it wasn't a gesture of pity. It was a chance at survival. He kept you alive because I couldn't bear to know I'd taken too much already. I built this house for men like us, those who returned but never really came back. I meant it to be a place of healing, a place where silence didn't destroy. If it's still standing, then maybe the idea still stands too. The estate, the land, the funds I've hidden within the trust, they're yours, but only if you do what I could not. Build something here for others who've forgotten how to live. Make it a sanctuary for the wounded, for the abandoned, for the strays, human or otherwise. Call it what you will, but I'd like to think Ray would approve. At the bottom of the page, a single line in smaller script read, Ray's Haven would be a fine name. Michael sat for a long time staring at those words, unable to move. The room seemed to fold around him, each creak of the beams, a voice, each gust of wind through the chimney, a sigh. Ellis said nothing. He simply watched, the kind of stillness only a man who has seen much can manage. Ray's Haven, Michael murmured, the name falling softly, almost reverently. He stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the snow had begun to lighten, the clouds parting just enough for the sun to throw a band of gold across the field. In that light, he saw the faint outline of the old kennels by the tree-line half-collapsed structures that must have once housed dogs. It felt like the past reaching forward, offering him a map. Over the next few days, the work began. Ellis, though well into his 70s, moved with surprising strength. Together they cleared the snow from the paths, opened the shutters, let light into rooms that hadn't seen it in years. Dust rose like ghosts, and then vanished. In the evenings, Michael sat by the fire with the general's notes spread before him, sketching plans on the backs of old envelopes. The vision was simple. Rebuild the kennels, repair the stables, open the gates again, but not for soldiers. For men who had survived the same silence he had. For those who came back from war to find the world no longer knew what to do with them. The days fell into a rhythm. Morning frost, hammering, the groan of old wood surrendering to repair. The smell of pine resin and fresh paint replaced the scent of dust. For the first time since he could remember, Michael's body ached not from despair, but from effort. He slept dreamlessly, the kind of sleep that earns its way through labor. It was during one of those mornings, when the sky was pale and clean, that he found the puppy. He was driving the old truck down toward the nearest town for supplies when he saw a small shape by the roadside, a flash of movement against the snow. He stopped, stepped out, and approached carefully. The dog was no bigger than his forearm, ribs sharp beneath dirty fur, one ear bent in half. It looked up with eyes that were both terrified and defiant. "Easy," Michael said softly, crouching. The animal trembled but didn't run. When he reached out, it hesitated, then pressed its head against his palm. The warmth of it startled him. He brought the pup back to the house wrapped in his coat. Ellis took one look and laughed, the sound echoing through the hall like a bell. "Looks like you've been chosen again," he said. Michael washed the puppy in the kitchen sink, the water running gray from the dirt. When he dried it and set it on the floor, it followed him room to room, stumbling on its oversized paws. That night, as he sat by the fire, the pup curled up beside his boots, sighed once, and fell asleep. "Echo," Michael said suddenly. "That's what I'll call you." The dog stirred slightly, as if approving. As weeks passed, the place transformed. The kennels became small cabins, the field behind the house was cleared for a garden, and Ellis worked to restore the generator and plumbing. Word began to spread, carried by veterans' networks and whispered among small-town bars. Men began to arrive, quiet, worn, carrying duffel bags filled with little more than silence. Some stayed a night, others longer. They repaired fences, painted walls, cooked meals. The house that had once felt like a tomb began to fill with voices, laughter, the bark of dogs, the scrape of shovels in frozen soil. Michael moved among them not as a leader, but as one of them. He taught them to build, to feed, to care. Some cried in the night, others stood by the window and watched the horizon, lost in private wars. He didn't offer sermons or sympathy, only the steady presence of someone who understood. He often thought of Cannon, wondering if this noise of living was what the old man had hoped for. In the evenings, when the fires burned low and the snow began again, he would sit on the porch with Echo beside him. The air was sharp and clean, the valley below dark as ink. Sometimes he spoke aloud, not to anyone in particular. "You were right, General," he'd say. "It wasn't foolish. It just took longer than you thought." Spring arrived without warning. The mountain thawed, rivers broke free from ice, and the sky brightened into something that resembled forgiveness. The fields filled with wildflowers, and the men began building an outdoor run for the dogs. Ellis, though slower now, refused to rest. "Can't stop working while the house still remembers what to be," he'd say. On a quiet afternoon, Michael climbed the slope behind the estate to where the tree line began. From there, he could see the roofs below stone, slate, sunlight glinting off glass. Smoke rose from the chimneys, and laughter drifted faintly up through the air. It was a sound so gentle it felt almost unreal. He sat on a rock, the wind cool against his face, and for the first time in decades, the tightness in his chest loosened. That night, as the men gathered for supper, a storm rolled in from the west. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rumbling like far-off artillery. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. In the dark, someone lit a lantern, its circle of light revealing faces, calm but watchful. Michael stood, lifted his glass. "To the ones who came home," he said, his voice steady. "And to the ones who didn't, but taught us how to." The reply came softly, a murmur that grew into something like a promise. To them. The storm passed by dawn. The air smelled of earth and pine. When Michael stepped outside, the clouds were breaking apart, spilling sunlight across the wet stones. The valley below glittered, as though the world had been washed clean. He turned toward the field, where Echo was running in wide, joyful circles, chasing nothing but freedom. Something moved near the tree line, a brief shimmer, impossible to describe, a shadow that seemed both there and not. He froze, heart lifting. It was the shape of a dog, taller, older, with a gait he knew by heart. Ray. The apparition turned once, paused, and then faded into the light. Michael smiled, not with disbelief but with gratitude. "You can rest now," he said quietly. "We're home." He stood there for a long time, the wind cool against his face, the mountains silent and immense around him. Behind him, the house loomed, not as a monument to grief, but as a living thing, full of breath and laughter and second chances. By evening, he sat on the porch again. Ellis joined him, lowering himself carefully onto the steps. "You've done it," the old man said. He'd be proud. Michael shook his head slowly. He'd say it's about damn time. They both laughed. The sound carried out into the fading light, mingling with the distant barks of dogs and the voices of men. As the sun sank behind the ridges, painting the clouds in gold and crimson, Michael leaned back in his chair, Echo's head resting on his boot. The air smelled of rain and smoke and life. Somewhere far above, an eagle circled, catching the last light. The house stood tall against the horizon, its windows glowing warmly. No longer a fortress, no longer a relic. It was what it had always meant to be, a refuge. And as night settled over the mountains, the line between memory and peace blurred completely, until only the quiet remained. The kind that heals instead of haunts. The kind that says, without words, that everything lost has finally been found. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next one, and share this video with someone who still believes that every soul deserves a second chance.